How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we return to the escalations over the Iran-Iraq-Iranian war into the second week with the large, incredible news, well, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the nominated leader of the Islamic Republic to replace Ayatollah Khamenei is his son, Mojtaba. So in this video, I wanted to explain three things. Firstly, why the appointment of Mojtaba tells us far more about who really controls Iran than many may expect or assume. Second, why American intelligence agencies had actually already warned that even a large-scale war might not remove the regime at all, let alone change it. And that third, why the longer this conflict endures, the more it may entrench the very forces that Washington, but especially Tel Aviv, had hoped to not just weaken, but completely eradicate.
This is the Global Gambit.
Indeed, just as the working week got started for many of us, early on March 9th, the Islamic Republic, led by the Assembly of Experts and clerical leaders, appointed its new supreme leader. It was largely expected at over 50% that he would win, and the decision was highly symbolic, although still deeply controversial because the Islamic Republic itself isn't a monolith. You see, unlike his father, Mojtaba does not possess the religious credentials traditionally required for the position. Iran's constitution technically requires the supreme leader to be a senior clerical authority, a mujtahid, someone who is recognized as a source of religious interpretation. Mojtaba is not. He has never held any formal political office, actually, and he has never published the kind of theological scholarship expected of a supreme leader. But he was chosen anyway, which of course tells us something important, because the appointment strongly suggests that the real power in Iran today does not lie with the clerical establishment. It lies with something more practical, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. Now, some of you have heard me say this before, including from guests that I host, but the IRG has long been the backbone of the Islamic Republic. Part military organization, part economic empire, part intelligence apparatus. And Mojtaba has been closely aligned with all of them. You see, for years he ran the Diet, the enormous court that surrounded his father and managed the networks of influence that kept the regime in power, much like, say, the keys of power that Putin has in Russia. But he has always been closely tied to some of the more hardline elements of the security too, including Hossein Taib, the former head of the IRGC's entire intelligence branch. Together, they have helped oversee the crushing of any form of reforms and transformation of Iran from this hybrid political system into something far closer to a security state. In other words, if anyone expected the death of Elder Khamenei to open the doors for reformers or restraints, that expectation is largely evaporating and demonstrates really how pragmatic the regime has shifted from a theocracy over the decades to ensure its survival, but also project power across the world. Now, what has many surprised other analysts is, of course, not just who became the supreme leader, but how smoothly this transition happened. Despite days of intense bombing, the Iranian state didn't really feel too much in terms of the people conducting the negotiations and debates over the successor. Many senior officials survived the initial strikes, and President Masoud Pezeshkian, he's been leading the council as well, this transitionary government system. Ali Larijani, the powerful secretary of the entire National Security Council, is still active. Military leadership with the Revolutionary Guards also appears largely intact, if they have had a few thousand losses. And of course, that outcome, you may argue, isn't entirely unexpected, because shortly before the war, well, the New York Times reported that an American intelligence agency had produced a classified assessment that reached a more sobering conclusion to the bombastic claims of Trump, that even a large-scale assault on Iran would likely not remove the regime. The report was produced by the National Intelligence Council, or NIC, which aggregated the analysis of America's 18 other agencies, concluding that its political system in Iran was specifically designed to survive this kind of scenario. Surprising, or not really. Specifically, that if the supreme leader were killed, succession mechanisms would activate. The clerical assembly of experts would appoint a replacement, and the military and security apparatus would ensure that continuity of power, even in the darkest of times. In other words, the system has been built precisely for this situation, And that is precisely what we are seeing unfold. And if anything, after the 12-day war, it gave time for Khamenei to make contingency plans, refinements, and improvements to the overall succession process. Now, again, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, but there are several reasons why the Iranian regime has proven far more resilient than many may argue. The first is preparation. Before his death, the elder had already anticipated the possibility of this day zero kind of scenario. Command structures were therefore increasingly decentralized. Military commanders were given pre-authorized targets and instructions to continue fighting, even if the central leadership was lost. This whole idea of the pressure points I've argued in a previous video. Some analysts believe the country is effectively divided into dozens of sort of autonomous military zones, each capable of operating surprisingly independent, even if corporate communications were disrupted. The besieged paramilitary network was reorganized into more decentralized cells. Weapons were distributed much more evenly. And importantly, the leadership figures moved into these hardened underground bunkers, which are harder to detect, even if you have bunker busters. Iran prepared for a scenario in which central authority may temporarily disappear, but not completely evaporate forever. And it is proving dividends. Now, of course, we have to not get too carried away of ourselves. Iran is not in a good position. The Americans, the Israelis control the airspace, and they are definitely dominating the military side. The war is placing enormous strain on Iranian state. Airstrikes have hit ports, factories, energy infrastructure. Fuel is already being rationed. Border crossings are completely closed. And supply chains are under severe pressure. All of what, well, if you have no internal access to oil or energy, then in your supply chains as well, that's a problem. Residents in Tehran describe the city that still functions, but only just. The shops do open, street cleaners still sweep the streets at dawn, if you like. People go about their daily lives. But these explosions that we've seen on the oil refinery, darkening the skies above them, well, they have a huge impact, not just on the physical capabilities of living, electricity cuts, but on the psyche of the people and whether they really will support this long-standing intervention by the US. If the strikes continue to expand, especially on the country's main export terminal on, say, Khark Island, the economic damage would be existential. Food shortages are a growing concern as it also approaches the Persian New Year. So while the regime survives the initial shock, the pressure on the state itself is steadily increasing. And, well, it's a bit of a dichotomy here because the Americans, the Israelis continue to strike. Will that mean that there is a behavioral change, a mindset shift in the people towards overall, if we can just live this out long enough, we'll get a better regime? Or can the regime last long enough that the overall sentiment towards the American and Israeli operations are doing so much permanent damage that it turns the overall sentiment of the people against them? It's a difficult one to tell, especially at the rate things are changing in only 10 days. So paradoxically, the point is that this pressure may actually strengthen the most militant elements of the regime. Because with the clerical leadership weakened and many political institutions damaged, the IRGC is the most unaffected and filling the vacuum. It now prosecutes the war with minimal civilian oversight. Military commanders are taking strategic decisions, and some analysts believe that the death of Khamenei may actually have liberated the guards from some constraints he'd actually previously imposed, even if they were from a theological standpoint. Khamenei's death has basically unshackled them. The result could be a regime that is not collapsing, but radicalizing even more militant, more nationalist, and potentially even less willing to compromise in any way, shape, or form, let alone with America or Israel. So this creates a different strategic reality for Trump, because if the regime survives, becomes more hardline, then the political outcome of this war looks very different from what Washington had claimed or hoped. Trump has repeatedly suggested that they can clean out this structure, that there will be no negotiations, only an unconditional surrender. And he's floated the idea of selecting this new leader, obviously in his reasonable mind. But American intelligence agencies are skeptical that any such outcome is plausible. And so there's no sign of mass uprising, despite this idea of arming the Kurds to do so. And the Iranian security forces have demonstrated repeatedly that are willing to use extreme violence to express any dissent. Thousands of protesters were killed during the demonstrations in early January, and those same security structures remain firmly in place, largely untouched. In fact, there is a growing risk that the war could produce complete opposite. If the regime is weakened to such an extent, any moderate or theological side will be completely removed and consolidated in the IRGC, meaning that all of them are hardliners, and then therefore providing any moderate leadership or restraint is not possible. That is not the first time that such a dynamic has occurred in history. External military pressure often strengthens authoritarian regimes rather than toppling them. It rallies that national sentiment, if done correctly, and sidelines any voices willing to try to be a middle ground. And so it brings us back to the original or difficult question. What exactly counts as success or win? The objective is to destroy Iran's military capabilities, then that is achievable, and we've seen them trying to clarify that. But if the objective is to change Iran's entire outlook, political system, and so on, how on earth can you prove that and ensure that? Leadership can be replaced, the command structure is more decentralized, and the security apparatus remains somewhat capable. So unless you completely take it out, but we have no idea how long that's going to be and what implications that has for the political conditions of Trump, the midterms, the global economy, and so much more. Are the Americans and Israelis really willing to go all out indefinitely for months to ensure that a complete or thorough eradication is achieved, which is unlikely in air power alone, as we know? But then you fund the Kurds, and that means you've got a few tens of thousands of forces, which already have been threatened by the Syrian Kurds to the Iranian Kurds not to do, up against a standing force of 150,000 IRGC members, let alone the Artesh and the Basij military we've mentioned before. All these factors for me yet again demonstrate this is not a good idea long term, because and you can look at it unidimensionally, militarily, but it's unwise to do that. 9 days into this war, and the picture for me is quite clear. Operationally, the US and Israel have obviously the military superiority, but politically, economically, the outcome is far less certain because the regime has not collapsed, and the IRGC appear to be the element that is appearing the strongest out of all of this. So again, you have to destroy everything, or you have to sort of stop and consider that if you radicalize the country even further, put the power in the hands of the most ideological, the conflict may well escalate in ways that we really don't want to consider. I.e., this may only be the beginning. And I, for one, am rather concerned about where this could go. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you think. And do join me on the channel more by subscribing and checking out the links below if you want to support me, or click on this video to understand the implications of all this on Russia. Take care.